Aloha everyone, my name is John and I'll be doing a research presentation on Steve Jobs, the Apple guy. So you may notice that I refer to him as the Apple guy because he founded Apple and he came up with some amazing Apple devices that we use right now. But you'll learn later on in the presentation that he actually became a CEO or a president in other businesses that he worked. So you'll find out later on. But first, let's talk about his early life. He was born on February 24th, 1955. One cool fact about Steve Jobs is he's actually an adoptee. So his birth parents were actually University of Wisconsin graduates. His mom's name is Joanne Shibley, and his father's name is Abdul Farab Jandali, who is a Syrian immigrant. So you can imagine that some of the Syrian blood is in Steve Jobs. And then, as I mentioned, he's an adoptee, so his adoptive parents are Paul and Clara Jobs. So, what led Steve Jobs to become an Apple builder, as in to build so much technology? Well, he learned about electronics through his adoptive father. And then, as years progressed, he met his high school friend Steve Wozniak, and they bond together and they actually build computer inside a garage in California. So basically, Steve Jobs' garage. And if you're curious about where this garage is located, it's at 2066 Christ Drive in Los Altos, California. So, what brought up to the invention of the Apple? What guided to the creation of the Apple? So, as I mentioned earlier, Steve Jobs met with Steve Wozniak, and then they actually become more interested in building technology. So they learned about the MITS Altair. So it's more of a build it yourself personal computer. So that led to the creation of the Apple One. Apple One is just a single circuit board, so it's just basic, very very basic computer, so to say, so to speak. And it's the motherboard of the Apple One was built on a piece of plywood. So again, basic. And then surprisingly, even though it's so easy, it's like a basic level computer. Up to 50 of these computers were actually sold, so they built a lot of profit from it. And that's when, since the invention is so successful, that's how Apple was co-founded in April 1st of 1976. So they have a home computer product that has been marketed for around $670, rough estimate. And that's when Apple II was invented. So it's a mass market personal computer, and it marks the symbol of the personal computing revolution. So that's the building block of personal computer. And that's when the Macintosh was later invented in 1984. But then a year later, a lot of conflict going on, so that's when Steve Jobs resigned from Apple in 1985. So what was the story behind it? Why did Steve Jobs suddenly resign as a CEO, or the co-founder, in that case, co-founder of Apple? Well, the actual story behind the departure was unknown, so there's no clear message, there's no clear clue of how Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. But there's some possible factors that's going on. First of all, the Macintosh sales were not that great. So that's one factor. Another factor is about the lost boardroom battle with CEO, well, the actual first CEO, John Sculley. So that's the first CEO that Jobs hired, because again, Jobs, he cannot just run the company and then run company supervise. That's too much for him. So that's why he actually hired John Sculley as the CEO. But then it brought a lot of issues, so that's why Steve Jobs left Apple. So that brings up to another business. It's called Next, or NEXT, however you call it. So this business, it focused on computers for higher education. Now that Jobs actually leaned onto another business, he actually took several people from Apple to work with him. The optical disk drives that are used in these NEXT computers, they were produced by Canon, which is a Japanese company. So there are a couple of inventions under this business. So we have the NEXT workstation that was invented in the 1990s. It's a technologically advanced computer with a built-in Ethernet port, and the price, so it's about almost $10,000. Excuse me. So because of that, because of the computer was like almost $10,000, the sales are not that great because again it's too high. Who's gonna afford $10,000? And it's in 1990, so a little questions. People come with some questions of why it's so expensive. And then there's another device known as the NEXT step. So it was invented in 1995. This is the sole ancestor of Apple's OS X and iOS. And that's when it has colorful graphical user interface known as a GUI and has certain many enhancements. So you notice this is more high tech that it's being applied to later versions of Apple devices. And because of that, that's when the Apple ended up buying the NEXT in 1996 for up to $426 million. And aside from the NEXT, he also has ties to Pixar. So it was originally called Lucasfilm, and it was owned by George Lucas. So Steve Jobs, he bought the graphics division in 1986 for up to $10 million. And what's so cool about Pixar, it's a successful computer animation film studio because they have the tools to develop 3D animation. The first 3D animation film under Pixar is the Toy Story, which is filmed in 1995. So it became a huge success, very success that Steve Jobs had suddenly become the president and CEO of Pixar Animation Studios. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, that Apple actually bought the NEXT in 1996. So that's when in 1997 he returned, and then prior to his return, he noticed that the sales were not as great. So it was under Gil Amelio, the CEO. He was the CEO of Apple, and as I mentioned earlier, the business was not going too well. So that's when Jobs returned in 1997. So he became the interim CEO. And then about 3 years later, that's when he became the permanent CEO of Apple. And guess what? More inventions from Apple. So you have the iMac, which is a little bit, excuse me, a little bit larger laptop, not laptop, but more of a computer. So it was invented in 1998. Then the music, and then it's about listening to music. So everyone's familiar with the iPod. So in 2001 is the original design of the iPod. In 2005, there's an iPod Nano, so it's a little bit smaller. And then that's when we have smartphones. So we have the iPhone, which was invented in 2007. And then you have computers, and in this case, laptops. So you have the MacBook was invented in 2006. And then they form lightweight ones. So that's the MacBook Air, which is in 2008. And then later on, Apple invented tablets known as the iPad in 2010. So far, Apple has been doing good since the return of Steve Jobs, but unfortunately, so many things has happened during Steve Jobs' life. And then, because in 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And then a year later, he underwent surgery in 2004 to get the tumor removed. So we think that, okay, he must be doing fine, right? Wrong. 2006, he was doing a keynote presentation when some of the audience noticed that he looked kind of sick on stage. So that's when there's a possible relapse of his pancreatic cancer. And then, because of that, he resigned his role as an Apple CEO in 2011. And then a new CEO, Tim Cook, became the new CEO of Apple. And then in June of 2011, that's when he addressed his final keynote, and that's for the invention of iCloud, which also involved in today's technology, since we have to save a lot of pictures, photos, documents up to iCloud, which can even music too. All of those important things in the technology world has to be saved into an iCloud storage. So that's why that's Steve Jobs' final presentation on the iCloud. And then unfortunately, he passed away on October 5th, 2011, at age 56. So, what we can learn from his entire life, from building computers in his garage to becoming a founder of Apple, and then working in several other businesses, the NEXT, and the Pixar, and then returning back to form more amazing devices, and then he lived a very amazing life, a busy life, and yeah, we will remember him for building all the technology that we are using today in the field of Apple. So that concludes the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for listening, and to Steve Jobs, may you rest in peace, man. Thank you so much for in giving us the Apple devices, our laptops, our phones, which will help us in our everyday lives.